Hello, everybody. We're going to begin. I am pleased to present our first plenary panel, Reproductive Justice Futurisms, Theories and Frameworks, Past, Present, and Future. We are going to begin with Joyce Follet, and we'll have each presenter briefly introduce themselves. We have 8 minutes to speak. I will, as a reminder, flash my 1-minute sign. We will have a 1-hour Q&A after our final presenter. Thank you, Joyce.
Thank you. Thank you. And thanks to Loretta and Jalicia and the organizing committee for this invitation. I am Joyce Follet, director of the Reproductive Justice History Project, which I will be telling you about. I welcome this chance to tell you about the project, what we're doing and why. I will show you a glimpse of the website that we were building, and I will extend an invitation to all of you to use this time together in the next couple of days to think about the themes that are being raised here that belong in this resource that we will continue to build. So what are we doing? We are building a digital toolkit that puts the histories of organizing for bodily autonomy in the hands of activists. This project began as a documentation initiative at the archives, the Sophia Smith collection here on campus many years ago. And in the course of working with RJ leaders, many of whom are here in the room, to collect their personal papers, to record their oral histories, to gather up the files of their organizations and bring those materials to the archives where scholars are likely to access them. We came to a shared commitment that while it's essential to preserve this evidence and the insights at the archives, we also need to commit to returning that evidence and insights to the people who it belongs to, the people in the organizations and communities who generate it, so that it can be used in movement building. We are, the goal of this project is to ground RJ strategy in RJ history. We are building what the RJ leaders are calling for, namely a trusted resource that counters the very intentional efforts by the opposition to erase and distort the very truths and lived realities that we are bringing to light. So I will give you a glimpse of the website that we are building. This is the medium that we have chosen as a way of returning evidence and insights to the communities. The website is called Roots of Reproductive Justice, 500 Years of Movement Stories. Basically, the site is structured into 4 levels: eras of history. Eras contain chapters, chapters contain stories, stories contain archival evidence. We have divided the 500 years of U.S. history into 10 eras. Those eras are negotiating the intimacies of empire, surviving enslavement, testing the limits of liberty, gender, and nation building. Era 4, forging freedom under white supremacy in the decades following the Civil War. Era 5, early 20th century, conceiving the general welfare, mothers of the race. 6, early radical movements of the 30s, 40s, and 50s, a strange democracy in a decolonizing world. 7, the 60s and 70s, whose great society? Speaking truth to power. 8, the 1980s and beyond, the explosion of organizing, breathing life into ourselves from self-help to collective action. Era 9, we come across the term reproductive justice, choosing reproductive justice at the same time that the right is coming to the fore. And finally, the present day, no body left behind, moving toward liberation. So that's the big span to show how central issues of sex, gender, and reproduction have been to the formation and ongoing maintenance of this entity that we call the United States. Each of these eras is divided into chapters which cover topical eras, topical issues, RJ issues that arise very clearly in those periods of time. I will take you to just one of these eras as an illustration. Immediately following the Civil War, forging freedom under white supremacy. There were chapters of freed women's organizing to reclaim the right to rear and bear children on their own terms. A chapter of stories of indigenous resistance to policies of boarding schools and allotment. A chapter of stories about organizing around exclusionary immigration policies that rely on sex and family norms as the basis of excluding Asians as a template for federal immigration policy. A chapter on struggles around the criminalization of birth control and abortion. Each of these chapters takes us into the stories that are really the heart of this project. This is where we meet real people organizing real struggles against one or another form of sexual, gender, or reproductive violence. So in this chapter, for example, Rape as State Violence, there are 3 stories so far. One on Frances Thomson, the trans woman who testifies to Congress about being raped. One, Winnemucca, the Paiute woman who calls attention to the sexual violence that is part and parcel of territorial expansion into native lands. And one on Ida B. Wells and her anti-lynching campaign. A story, and again, these are the heart of this toolkit. This story about Ida B. Wells, a story is very short. It's 1,000 to 1,200 words. It emphasizes agency over victimization, and it is richly documented with pieces of archival evidence, including, for example, here's a document. You can go to the full document of Ida B. Wells' writings and reports. And this visual material, there's her struggle with the leader of the largest white women's organization of the time, Frances Willard. And these materials obviously add visual evidence, but they're visual interest, but they're also evidence of these struggles and the lessons that can be learned from them. All the other eras fill out similarly with chapters on different issues, many issues. I can't go into more in detail at this point, but before I leave the site, I want to tell you about one specific feature of this site that makes it a real organizing tool. And that is a feature that allows you to save material according to a certain search term: violence, sterilization, sexual violence. Save that collection, and the magical piece is that there are blanks that you can use to add your own material. Your picture of your Jalicia's grandmother can go here, or or a pamphlet from your organization. And this makes it really the toolkit an ongoing process, not just a finite resource. So that's our the very exciting part of this. Very briefly, where are we going from here? At this point, we are looking at the next 2 days and hoping that one of the tags that people will be able to use to select material here will be reproductive technology. We hope you will feed us your ideas. There are forms around, and there's a QR code in your agenda to submit your ideas. What are the themes that belong in this resource, so that this topic appears as it should throughout the and we will continue to build this. We will continue, and if you've already submitted a story, we will be in touch with you as we refine the section of the website where your story belongs, so we can work with you on that. And finally, the project is in the process of migrating from Smith College, where it has incubated for several years, to Collective Power for Reproductive Justice. The movement building organization we all know and love, formerly CLIP, and Collective Power plans to not only weave this resource into its leadership development and community education programs, but continue to build out the addition of scholarship and new material, so it will continue to get closer and closer to a full reflection of the breadth and depth of the RJ movement. Thank you.
Thank you, Joyce. That was wonderful. Next, we are going to hear from the Crystal Fleming.
The Crystal Fleming. Is this on? Is this working? Okay. Thank you. Thank you for the invitation to come back. Thank you to Professors Loretta Ross and Jalicia Jolly for the honor of participating in this convening. Last year, I spoke about techno-fascism and Octavia Butler, and somehow also tarot and divination and Malidoma Somé. Today, my talk is focused on spirituality, building on some of what I shared last year. I do have to say, I was very nervous, worrying that as someone who's not a traditional RJ scholar, that I would not have anything particularly groundbreaking or helpful to share. And then I went to my tarot cards and my ancestors, and they were like, "Child, we got something to say." So here I am again. The talk is entitled Oracle, Prophecy as Black Feminist Praxis. My aim is to provide some language, some history as well, to invoke a liberatory vision of spirituality that might inform our understanding of what the future entails, drawing upon indigenous cosmologies and Black women's recorded experiences of queering and bending time. We tend to associate prophecy with initiated priests and priestesses, sanctified seers, and others claiming unique, supposedly special ability to foresee and foretell the future. Oracle, derived from the Latin oraculum and orare, meaning to speak, can denote sharing of inspired utterances, psychic information, and wisdom. Prediction and prophecy are elements of what I'm referring to as oracle knowledge. In the Afrofuturistic Parable series by Octavia Butler, Lauren Olamina foresees a future in which our destiny is written in the stars. She was a Black girl oracle. Octavia Butler herself has been called a Black girl oracle. Whoopi Goldberg played Guinan in Star Trek, one of my faves, a Black girl oracle. But being a Black girl oracle is not just a sci-fi or fantasy trope, a plot device, or a fantastic narrative. Psychic and spiritual ability is not limited to sanctified special people. Black feminist accounts of oracle knowledge teach us that ordinary people can cultivate an extraordinary, intimate, even erotic relationship with time, not just within the pages of science fiction, but also within the ordinary fabric of our lives. From this perspective, the future is not situated in linear time, a temporal destination that we merely anticipate or plan for, imagine, or perhaps regard with fear and dread. Instead, the future constitutes a proximate reality that is intertwined in mysterious ways with the here and the now, allowing for us to foresee and shape what is to come. In speaking about this convening and this topic with my wife, she reminded me that religion and spirituality are particularly important to directly address in conversations about RJ, given the history of religion being weaponized against us, against women and gendered minorities, to justify decimating, exploiting, and policing, as well as profiting from our reproductive capacities. Religion is intertwined with eugenics and nationalisms, as well as the use of fascism to trample human rights. Left unchecked, these apex predators that Loretta is speaking to us about, right? These apex predators and religious zealots might indeed destroy this world. Just the other day, I read a headline in the context of the US bombing Iran about Christian right-wing extremists who have infiltrated the highest levels of the US government and apparently are trying to bring about Armageddon so that Jesus can come back. This is the kind of genocidal religious fanaticism that we must uproot, confront, and overcome. And part of the overcoming entails psychic and spiritual healing, excavating indigenous ways of knowing and transforming our futures by remembering the vast wellsprings of wisdom, guidance, and information that we can access in community with our ancestors and the spirit world. And so, in the spirit of Sankofa, I am remembering Harriet Tubman's prophetic visions. I am remembering Harriet Jacobs' autobiographical accounts of transcending slavery and patriarchy with her spiritual and psychic powers. I am remembering Zora Neale Hurston's writings on hoodoo and voodoo. I am remembering Akasha Gloria Hull's groundbreaking soul talk. I am remembering Lucille Clifton's spirit writings, her channeling, and her Ouija board. I am remembering M. Jackie Alexander's work on the sacred. I am remembering Alexis Pauline Gumb's oracle work, practicing divination before university crowds, and she did that when I invited her to Stony Brook University. I am remembering the oracle cards and ancestral veneration at last year's Reproductive Justice Futurism convening. I am remembering the moment I turned to my tarot cards to figure out what the hell to talk about today. I am remembering my mother. I am remembering you. In sharing these reflections on the spiritual dimensions of futurism, I do not do so as an enlightened being. I cuss out far too many people to be called enlightened. I'm not an initiated practitioner within a religious order, but I share these reflections as an ordinary Black girl from Chattanooga, Tennessee, born to a single teenage mom who, ever since I can remember, has been sharing stories of her psychic and otherworldly experiences, some of which I have witnessed unfold in real time. I'm also sharing these reflections as someone who has been long fascinated by my own experiences with psychic phenomenon and spiritual powers. I experience deep pleasure in healing, practicing ancestral communication and mediumship. Yes, that means I talk to but do not see dead people. I engage in intuitive inquiry and divination. And I know that I am not alone in these pursuits and pleasures, that there are others in the room who cultivate an intimate relationship with the unseen through a wide range of religious, spiritual, and psychic pursuits. In uses of the erotic, Audre Lorde reminds us that, quote, the dichotomy between spiritual and the political is false, resulting from an incomplete attention to our erotic knowledge. I understand oracle and prophetic knowledge as forms of erotic power. Lorde articulated erotic empowerment in spiritual terms, writing that, quote, the erotic is a resource within each of us that lies deeply in a female and spiritual plane, firmly rooted in the power of our own unexpressed and unrecognized feeling. The erotic, thus, I suggest, flows from an internal knowing, a depth of feeling that has psychic and spiritual dimensions. It is a conscious orientation toward withinness, or what scholars in Black studies refer to as interiority. Also shout out to Toni Morrison. Interiority charged with creative power. What might it mean for us to experience an erotic relationship with the future? if time is not linear, unidirectional passage from the past to the present and future, if it is more mysterious and magical than the static, stale, and Western formulation suggests, if the very fabric of time can be lifted and peeled back like a veil, pierced with erotic, spiritual, and ancestral knowledge, where does that leave us in relation to the future? What even is the future? These are ontological questions, and ontological questions are generative. There is an uncertainty principle here that is worth sitting with. Physicists have not settled debates over the mysteries of time, have not yet figured out whether the future is deterministic, a mechanical unfolding predetermined by the accumulation of the past, or probabilistic, a cascade of possibilities unfolding across a multiverse. But physicists are not the only ones who can grapple and experiment with time. We can build psychic and intuitive capacities. We can learn to listen to that still small voice. We can dream glimpses of things to come. We can receive information and guidance from our ancestors and spirit guides. And from the perspective of indigenous ways of knowing, these are not unusual or extraordinary experiences. Prophetic modes of knowledge and erotic encounters with time are ordinary features of our Black-ass lives. I am wrapping up, I promise. Akasha Hole situates Black women's psychic capacities, supernatural abilities, and divination within what she calls, quote, the historical cultural specificities of African American spiritual traditions, encompassing a wide range of practices, including revering the dead, acknowledging the reality of ghosts and spirit possession, honoring superstition, these are her words, and the unseen world, giving credence to second sight and other supersensory perceptions, paying homage to African deities, as we are doing today, practicing voodoo and hoodoo, root working, and so on. Hull argues that such an orientation to the unseen constitutes a challenge to dominant Eurocentric ontologies that are rarely validated and acknowledged as legitimate ways of knowing. Similarly, religious studies scholars Yvonne Chirot, who also happened to be the hoodoo consultant on the film Sinners, trace the history of divination rituals within Afro-diasporic healing practices and traditions of conjure. So in wrapping up, I do want to invoke the work of Nigerian-American scholar and writer D.K. Okoro, whose 2022 publication of Futurism and the African Imagination sought to broaden the analytical lens from a focus on the U.S. to examine developments in African cultural production. DK highlights the importance of African indigenous beliefs as seen through works inspired by African cosmology. This return to African cosmology is both necessary and instructive as it orients us towards the cultural substrate of indigenous ways of knowing that inform art, literature, Afrofuturism. These indigenous epistemologies shape our diasporic conceptions of reality, including how we understand time. Reclaiming and validating this knowledge is a step towards epistemic and spiritual healing from the psychic trauma of colonialism and what Bell Hooks refers to as white supremacist, capitalist, heteropatriarchy. I'm gonna stop there because Bell Hooks dropped the mic. So, thank you.
Thank you, Crystal. Thank you. What a rich conversation we've had so far. We are going to pass the mic to Laurie and Nsiah Jefferson. Take it away, Laurie. Thank you.
Really excited to be here today. Really excited to be here today, minus the snow. And I'm Laurie Nsiah Jefferson. I'm the director for the Center for Women in Politics and Public Policy at UMass Boston, as well as being the director of the Gender Leadership and Public Policy Graduate and Public Policy Program, more broadly. So, first of all, my favorite people, Loretta and Jalicia, thank you so much for inviting me to be here today. So I'm going to jump right into it, and I'm going to talk about the work that I did over the years. Okay, I'm never good with microphones. I'm going to talk about. Oh, I heard that. All right now. Did you hear that?
I did.
But you know what? I can work on that. Don't worry about it. So reproductive technologies have never been neutral. Not in this country, not for black women, not for low-income women, not for incarcerated women, and for many other women. When I began writing in the 1980s about reproductive law and reproductive technology, I wasn't studying abstract innovation. I was watching the state renegotiate control over black women's bodies. Under slavery, our fertility was wealth generation. Under eugenics, our fertility was framed as degeneration. By the 1990s, our fertility had become framed as a budget line item. I'm a policy scholar. And that shift should disturb all of us. Then became the Reagan administration, which was obsessed with dependency. Y'all remember that? The so-called welfare queen, the underclass, the moral panic around black motherhood, racial narratives about fit motherhood, economic discourses about public cost, global development agendas targeting women in the global south, clinical practices embedded in bias. Does that all sound familiar? Mm-hmm. Y'all been around for a while? And in that exact climate, long-acting contraceptives like Norplant and Depo-Provera were introduced. In my 1989 article, y'all gonna know how old I am soon, Reproductive Laws, Women of Color and Low-Income Women, I argued that reproductive law operates inside racial hierarchy. And I've heard we've been saying this all morning already. The argument was not theoretical. Judges were suggesting Norplant as a condition of probation. Policymakers were discussing financial incentives, hear me, for women on public assistance to use long-acting contraception. Let's sit with that for a moment. Just think about that. We were treating fertility suppression as anti-poverty strategy. Instead of addressing structural racism, underfunded schools, housing segregation, labor market exclusion, and I could go on and on with that list, we argued the reproductive capacity, we targeted the reproductive capacity of marginalized women. This was not in any way reproductive freedom. This was reproductive management, and may I say it's even worse. I kind of kept it nice. But at the same time, that poor women were being encouraged, sometimes pressured, and many times pressured, to suppress fertility, and I think Jalecia said this earlier on, wealthier women were gaining increasing access to fertility enhancement technologies. And one of the things I was doing back then is I was also studying infertility in women of color, particularly black women. And the infertility rate for black women was much higher than the infertility rate for white women. But our fertility was being suppressed, and theirs going the other way. In reproductive technology, perspectives and implications for low-income women and women of color, Hall and I, and this was in 1989, raised a question that still unsettles people. Why is technological innovation framed as empowerment for some women and discipline? You're a little girl, discipline for others. Some women were being helped to have children, others were being encouraged not to. That asymmetry is policy. That was policy. That asymmetry was also power. In my 1996 critique in the University of Chicago Law School Roundtable Journal, I challenged the comforting myth that eugenics ended. Eugenics is not just forced sterilization, and I know a lot of us think about it that way. It is a mindset. It is a moment when we begin to ask, which populations are too costly? Which children are undesirable? Which births are irresponsible? In the 1980s and the 1990s, that rhetoric was everywhere, coded but clear. Tax burden, cycle of poverty, social pathology, I could go on. When fertility becomes framed as fiscal threat, we are talking and we are walking on some very old ground, right? By the early 1990s, I shifted to reproductive genetics. In my 1993 and 1994 work on access to genetic testing for low-income women and women of color, I examined how these services were distributed. What I found was predictable and disturbing. Access was stratified based on insurance, counseling was uneven, informed consent was shaped by economic vulnerability, choice without structural equity is fragile. Choice made racial hierarchy is constrained. Okay, excuse me. Choice inside racial hierarchy is strained. And we must stop pretending otherwise. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about genetics. Did a little bit of work on that as well. In my 1996 critique in the University of Chicago Law School Roundtable, I pushed back against the accompanying idea that eugenics was safely in the past. Because whenever fertility is framed as social burden, whenever certain populations are described as costly, whenever reproduction becomes tied to public expense, we are dangerously close to that logic of eugenics. The language changes, the architecture remains. So now I'm going to move on to the work that we did in reference to pharmacogenomics. So in 2003, in my chapter on pharmacogenomics, I raised concerns about how emerging genomic science was beginning to racialize biology under the banner of personalization. The promise was individualized medicine, but I cautioned that if race became shorthand for genetic differences, we risk rebiologing inequality. And I'd say equity. Sometimes I use inequality, but I always should say equity. And here is where this ties directly back to reproductive justice. Pharmacogenomics influences, let's see where I am here, it influences fertility drugs, maternal care medications, pregnancy-related treatments, drug dosing protocols. If genomic databases underrepresent communities of color, if race is used as a proxy for genetic variation, if risk algorithms are trained on unequal data, then reproductive care becomes shaped by flawed assumptions masquerading as precision. And once inequality is coded into molecular science, it becomes harder to challenge, but we're going to challenge it because now it appears objective. This is what I mean when I say the site shifts from contraceptive policy to genetic counseling to molecular categorization. The tools evolve, again, the hierarchy adapts. So today we have in vitro fertilization, we have AI fertility tracking, we have embryo selection, we have personalized medicine becoming even more common, but optimization for whom? Precision based on whose data, personalized within whose structural reality. We also should be asking the questions, who will have access to enhancement technologies, whose embryos will be screened out, whose reproductive data will be commodified, will algorithmic bias, and I call it algorithmic oppression when I remember, shapes generic risk categories. Will digital surveillance criminalize pregnancy outcomes? Almost done. The tools are more sophisticated, but the questions remain hauntingly similar. If we are not vigilant, reproductive technologies will not simply reflect inequities, they will accelerate it. So when we think about Black women's reproductive lives, they sit at the intersection of race, gender, class, criminalization, health inequity, and more. Technology does not dissolve these factors, it enters them. If regulation does not account for intersectionality, inequity will be built into the infrastructure. And once coded into infrastructure, inequality becomes scalable. In the 1980s, I learned something that continues to guide my work. Reproductive technologies are policy instruments. They are not merely medical tools. They are deployed to expand autonomy or to manage populations. The difference lies in governance. It lies in who sits at the policy table, who shapes regulation, who controls funding practices, who controls funding priorities, who defines risk, who defines desirable life. As a Black woman and a policy scholar, I remain passionate and vigilant because I know how quickly innovation can outpace justice. I'm going to say that again. I understand how quickly innovation can outpace justice. If the 1990s in 1980s taught us anything, it is this. When structural inequality goes unaddressed, reproductive technologies will map onto it. So the future, we must require community-based ethical oversight, data privacy protection, strong informed consent standards, protection from criminalization, investment in maternal equity, and meaningful representation of Black and brown women in biotech governance. We must refuse a future in which technology advances while justice stalls. We must insist that reproductive autonomy includes, as we say, the right to have children, the right not to have children, and the right to raise children in communities that are safe, resourced, and free. Past is prologue, but it is not destiny. The future of reproductive technologies is being written now in policy debates, in regulations, in frameworks, and in funding streams. And we, especially Black women scholars, organizers, and policymakers, must be authors of that future, not subjects of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Laurie. Next up, we have Rosemarie Garland Thomson, who is going to step to the podium. While she sets up, I just want to share what's sitting with me. The language changes, the architecture remains. How quickly innovation outpaces justice.
Thank you. I'm Rosemarie Garland Thomson. I'm delighted to be here with you all today. I want to give thanks to Loretta Ross and to Jalicia Jolly and Smith College and all of you here. I'm really moved and, as I said, honored to be here. Loretta Ross and I met decades ago now, I think. Yes. In a feminist theory class, several feminist theory graduate seminars at Emory University. And so we've been together for a long time. Thank you. Thank you for all of this. Loretta asked me to talk briefly and somewhat informally here to you today for just a few minutes on the history and the future of the disability justice movement. So I prepared a slide presentation that I'm going to talk through informally because I wanted to offer several modes of information here, so you'll have, which makes for a much more accessible presentation or an accessible presentation. So you'll have words, my words, you'll have words on screen, and you'll have images on the screen for my brief presentation. I don't know that I said this. I'm an English professor, but I'm also a bioethicist now, and that has shaped the work that I have done in cultural disability studies and cultural feminist theories over a long time. So, I'm going to talk about the disability justice movement, as I mentioned. And I'll begin, it works out very nicely. Everything that has been said before has set up for beginning here to talk about eugenics. And of course, eugenics in this poster from 1925 is defined as the self-direction of human evolution. Like a tree, eugenics draws its materials from many sources and organizes them into an harmonious entity. And I want to emphasize that eugenics was understood as both positive and progressive in the last decades of the 19th century and the early decades of the 20th century. And that I'm going to go on to suggest what was wrong with the idea of improving human beings, making us better, and what has happened as a result of the concept of eugenics. So the concept of eugenics brings forward the concept of the normal as a statistical phantom and an aspirational ideal. The philosopher Ian Hacking has suggested that normal was one of the most powerful ideological tools of the 20th century. So I'm showing here a 1893 anthropometric composite figures by Dudley Sargent of normal or normative man and a normative woman. Now, you're going to be able to understand quite clearly from this presentation that what was understood as ideal and what was understood as normal was a combination of people who were non-disabled and white for the most part. And you're seeing this in these figures here that I'm showing, which are physically normal and also, of course, white. This continued through the first half of the 20th century. I'm showing here an example of how eugenics put forward an improved person who was also a white person and a fully able-bodied person. This is an example from 1949 of a most perfect baby contest. We see here 3 mothers, 3 babies, all of whom appear to be non-disabled and, of course, appear to be at the same time white. The human rights movement is part of the history of the disability rights movement. It begins in the mid-20th century at the end of World War II, and the recognition of the violations that science and medicine put forward into humanity in the Holocaust and in many other places during the 20th century. And I'm showing here an image of Eleanor Roosevelt holding up the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights. And I want to suggest that a series of laws and treaties have established the trajectory of the disability rights movement in the 20th century, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. The human rights movement gave way in the mid-20th century to the civil rights movement, beginning with the Black civil rights movement in the 1940s and 50s. And of course, one can actually reach way back beyond this, but I'm putting forward a rather simplified timeline for us here today. I'm showing an image here that I think illustrates the concept of intersectionality as we know it in critical theory. These are a group of disability rights activists in the United States, and a photograph taken at some kind of a protest movement, probably in New York, but in some urban setting. And we have a collection of people with disabilities here in the foreground who are protesting, people with wheelchairs, people who are small people, people who are large people, people with a wide range of racial and ability characteristics, and they're holding up a sign that is a quote from Martin Luther King that says, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." And so what we see moving through the 20th century is a combination of these rights movements that come from different groups, whether they're racial groups, gender groups, or ability groups, that coalesce in the formation of these laws and practices. And for the disability rights movement or the disability justice movement, we have, again, a series of treaties and laws that I want to emphasize over and over again. I'm showing you here an image of the Americans with Disabilities Act, which was only one law that comes in 1990, then again in 2009. Internationally, we have the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and I'm showing you the logos from these two sets of treaties that are very important because they establish a group of people who are officially people with disabilities. And these people who are identified and identify as people with disabilities have newly created rights and obligations. In the United States, for example, people with disabilities have the right to require under law, or to request under law, reasonable accommodations and the right to sue for discrimination when they have been discriminated against. Alongside of the legal laws and protocols that come forward, we also have a very active religious human rights set of covenants that come forward that support people with disabilities. I'm showing you, and this is controversial, we can talk about this, Pope Francis, who was important in advocating for policies and practices and logics to protect people with disabilities. Perhaps most important, the changes in the public space that the disability rights movement brought forward, this integration of people who had been excluded from public schools and public spaces. These laws brought forward a whole cadre of people, and I'm showing you here an example of actually a colleague and friend of mine whose name is Haben Girma. She's a disability rights advocate. She is the first deaf-blind person to graduate from Harvard Law School. And what's important to know about somebody like Haben is that it would have been impossible before the disability rights movement for someone like Haben to go to school at all. And this is part of what these legislative and integrative policies created, and that is to say, a group of some attitudes about disability. I'm going to take one more minute here, and I'm going to summarize some of these attitudes or beliefs. One is the human variations we think of as disabilities are part of the human condition, and they occur in every life and family and are a theme in all art and culture. In other words, what we want to do is universalize disability, not have it be something over on the edges of society and the human community, but at the very center. The lived experience, another claim here of the disability rights and the disability justice movement. The lived experiences of disability give people and communities opportunities for expression, creativity, resourcefulness, relationships, and flourishing. A third point, disability is an opportunity. I want to use that word again. It's a positive characteristic, or can be, to explore, to redefine, and to make new stories about what it means to be human. These are stories that work against the logic of eugenics. I'm going to skip over the opposition a little bit because I've run out of time, but you may want to look up or read a little bit more about liberal eugenics, which is a part of the conversation in bioethics and in reproductive ethics that is put forward in part by the philosopher Peter Singer and other utilitarian philosophers, but I didn't want to give that much time to the opposition. But I do want to spend just a little bit of a moment returning to the idea of how eugenics correlates with race and gender and disability or ability, the ability system. I'm showing here an image which I think is really important in reproductive justice, and that is the idea of what I call the normate template. That's what is imagined as being the normal and expected kind of person. The various characteristics that this normate template have are a high IQ, and Dorothy Roberts and I have talked a lot about what an IQ might be. Of course, it's not anything, actually. No baldness, perfect pitch, good legs. This child could be a sprinter, 20/20 vision, low risk of Alzheimer's, breast cancer, and strokes. Again, what goes unstated here is that this child is a white baby. And so finally, what I want to suggest is there is a proliferation then in the cultural world, the educational world, the policy world, the social world of various elements that have the word disability in them as a result of the disability rights movement and the larger civil and human rights movement. And I've listed simply here some of these words. We talk now fluently about disability culture. We talk about disability ethics, disability justice, disability law, disability studies, and disability conservation. So I'll end here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rosemarie. All right. Next, we have Amelie Horn. Take it away, Amelie.
Hi, y'all. Oh, is it on? Should be on. It's on? Okay, we're good. Hi, I'm Amelie. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm one of the project coordinators here with the RJF team. And Loretta actually invited me to speak on the intersections of pronatalism, white supremacy, and white women's reproduction. And so out of that came this talk, Creating White Children, Controlling White Women, Forced and Coerced Reproduction Under White Supremacy. I'm going to start with the definition of white supremacy that I'll be using. And the definition I'm using today, although there are many great definitions, comes from Frances Lee Ansley. She describes it as white supremacy is a political, economic, and cultural system in which whites overwhelmingly control power and material resources. And implicit in this definition is that white supremacy at its core is about the perpetuation of whiteness and the erasure or dehumanization of people of color and non-whiteness. Such a system requires the existence of people recognized as white, whether through birth into already classified white groups or through processes of racial incorporation. Birth here is clearly the more straightforward path. Racial incorporation is a longer process. And so in other words, white supremacy requires the creation of white children. And the fear that these children will not be created or that not enough of them will be created is one of the key anxieties behind the Great Replacement theory. And the responses to the Great Replacement theory really center around two key pillars: preventing the birth of non-white children, often through violence against people of color, and encouraging or forcing the birth of more white children through white women's reproductive labor. Today I'm going to focus on the latter to examine how white supremacists try to force and coerce the creation of white babies and how that negatively affects white women's reproductive autonomy. I'm going to explore three distinct categories of ways that this happens. So first, forced breeding, which is a term I got from Loretta Ross, and then coercion using technology, and finally coercion within a patriarchal trad wife system. So in terms of forced breeding, obviously there's abortion bans. Abortion constitutes a form of forced breeding because you are not being able to choose whether or not to have a child. And I want to note here that most people who have abortions are not white in this country, and that non-white groups see their already disproportionate maternal mortality rates rise significantly with abortion bans. And this, if anything, to white supremacists is like another benefit. It serves very much two purposes. Even if a lot of their anti-abortion agenda and their explicit motivations are about the creation of white children and preventing white women from having abortions. And this has been true since the beginning of the anti-abortion movement in the United States. Sociologists Nicole and Tamara Kay noted with regards to the criminalization of abortion in the late 19th century that while laws regulating abortion would ultimately affect all women, physicians argued that middle-class Anglo-Saxon married women were those obtaining abortions and that their use of abortion to curtail childbearing threatened the Anglo-Saxon race, like a form of racial suicide. And at the time, these anti-abortion laws were also being used to prosecute and delegitimize Black and Indigenous midwives, making birth more unsafe in those communities. And this continues. I mean, in the 1980s, the KKK literally created wanted posters for abortion providers. And so we see this link between white supremacy and anti-abortion movements that has existed and continues to exist today. Of course, not everyone who's anti-abortion is explicitly a white supremacist, but they are in a movement that is allied with white supremacy. And when you agree with white supremacists, you should probably start reevaluating your choices in life. All of this ties to both a disregard for women's autonomy and safety, because if this country was really so pro-life, we would not have the maternal mortality rates that we have, and they get even higher when abortion is banned. And we wouldn't discount the quality of life and mental health impacts of forced pregnancy. Within the white supremacist project, the anti-abortion movement, white women's lives and health and autonomy are inevitably becoming an accepted collateral damage towards perpetuating a system of white supremacy. And so that's one aspect of how white supremacy impacts white women's reproductive autonomy. Another one is coercion through technology. I'm going to talk mostly about egg donation as an industry in the United States, but there are definitely other methods of using technology to coerce reproduction, like the prevalence of birth control misinformation on social media. I don't know if y'all have seen all the Instagram stuff, but it is scary. White women are often targeted by really aggressive egg donor recruitment. And it's everywhere. It's on social media, it's on college campuses, it's on Craigslist. And they receive up to 8 times more compensation for their eggs than Black women. And so they are being not only recruited at higher rates, they are being recruited using aggressive financial tactics. In Dr. Tober's book, Economics, she found that while minimum and average compensation was relatively constant across racial groups, the highest compensation for white and Asian donors in the study was between $75,000 and $100,000.
Per egg?
Per donation cycle. That's crazy, right? And the average white donor received $11,000 on a cycle. Informally talking with students, I found that basically every single white and Southeast Asian student who I've spoken to has seen ads on Instagram for egg donation. I don't think I've met a Black student yet who has had significant ads on Instagram. It is crazy, y'all. And this money can be life-changing, right? Like, young women hold 63% of student debt in this country, and when the average white woman graduates, she'll have over $30,000 of student debt. Doing the math, that's about 3 cycles. That seems like a pretty reasonable trade for a lot of people. And these young people are being told by clinics that the complication rate for these procedures is around 1% to 2%. That is not based in research. And furthermore, these donors can then be pressured by clinics with further financial incentives and emotional manipulation into undergoing multiple back-to-back cycles, increasing their risks of complications. This lack of transparency around risks and the fact that this is being offered to young people in a situation of economic precarity brings up an ethical dilemma around undue inducement, essentially the question of how ethical is it to make an offer that is too good to refuse. I highly recommend Dr. Bonnie Steinbach's article on that. And it also calls into question informed consent for donors. You cannot give informed consent if you do not know what the risks are, especially if you're told that your risk is 1%. That's crazy. So the question becomes, is it ethical to take advantage of young people's lack of knowledge and economic pressure? Obviously not. No. But white supremacy does not care, right? They want white eggs for white children for perpetuation of the white class. And you all should go read Economics by Diane Tober. So we have this model of coerced reproduction that's really tech-based, really college-educated. It really explicitly aimed often at college-educated women. They're often advertising specifically for that. And then we also have what I would call the trad wife model of reproductive coercion. And I want to start this by talking about a woman who I actually know, because I think it's really easy to see tradwives as this monolith of like, these are all terrible people. Like, they're all ignorant. What are they doing? A few summers ago, I actually interned with a home birth midwife, and I was working with a population and coworkers who were much more evangelical and conservative than I realized when I signed on. I spent that summer so far in the closet, I swear to God, I would have found Narnia if it was there. I was just real quiet. But one of my coworkers, who I'm going to call Sarah, was extremely kind to me on a personal level, extremely generous with teaching me about things. Also believed in a lot of conspiracy theories that I was like, wow, this is crazy, but you are my ride, so I'm not going to say nothing. She was happy to share the information. And when I knew her, she was 27 with 8 kids under 9. She had been married to a friend of her father in their high-control evangelical church when she was 18 and he was 28. She was working with a midwife, homeschooling their children, and urban homesteading all at the same time. I think about her a lot. Within evangelical white supremacist culture, theology strips women of their sense of autonomy from childhood onward. I would describe this as a form of grooming. They're raised under, I don't know if anyone here heard of umbrellas of protection? No? Congratulations. And I'm sorry. Umbrellas of protection are the spiritual protection that a child is under within an evangelical concept. So you have your pastor, you have under your pastor your husband or your father, then you have the wife, and then you have the children. Your salvation depends on being under these umbrellas. And these umbrellas have a responsibility to you and your salvation, right? And so you have to listen to your husband. You know, you're taught, wives obey your husbands. You're taught that you have sexual duties to your husband. You are not to deny him. It is biblical that you cannot say no. In theory, husbands also have duties to their wives, but this is not talked about as much. And then you have the quiverful ideology, the idea that Christians are supposed to have as many children as possible, and it is your duty by God to not use birth control. Be fruitful and multiply. And this is reinforced by white women writers, evangelical writers. Has anyone here read Passion and Purity by Elizabeth Elliot? Congratulations, don't. Or Anne Ortland has a whole bunch of them. Disciplines of the Home, Fearlessly Feminine. There's like something that's like something of the beautiful woman or habits of the beautiful woman. And it traps these women in a cycle of total vulnerability. Spiritually, they're under men, and they need to remain in relationship with that man. Financially, you're coming out of high school and you've got 8 kids. What are you going to do for work? How can you leave? And not to mention that you have a whole bunch of kids, and so you probably have to stay home, if not homeschool, because that's culturally normal. And it traps young women in this cycle of poverty and dependence. I want to conclude by looking at how these categories, how we can actually do a little bit of solution work. I know it's a little early in the conference for that. And I want to start with some potential solutions. For forced breeding and abortion restrictions, obviously there's legislation. Good luck with that right now. But also creative access education. How can you access an abortion where you are? And who can you talk to get somewhere where you can get an abortion? Through coercion, through technology, I think one of the big things we need is economic reforms. We need free or cheap education so that we have our children entering their adulthood without immediate economic precarity. Urgent research needs to be done into emerging technologies so that we can have informed consent in this space. There needs to be education initiatives aimed at targeted groups and written to engage them. I wonder if we could take advantage of the same algorithms that egg donation clinics take advantage of. An RJ-based mandatory health class seems like a really good idea to me, including impartial education around donors and around different ways of conceiving children. And also we need to combat digital misinformation and unpack MAHA, which does a great job of presenting really easy to understand and emotionally resonant incorrect conclusions. And finally, the trad wife model. I think a lot of this needs to be prevention through education for young girls, where they can learn not just about their options, but how to achieve them. How do you apply for college? How do you do things without a man? There's a huge question here around homeschooling and what rights children and teens have to education and information independent of what their parents believe. I can't answer that question, but I do think we need to start talking about it. What right do these kids have to an education? The RJF health class that I mentioned should include education around family planning, financial abuse, consent, and women who are living different kinds of lives. There needs to be work by faith leaders and peers to not just unpack antiquated theology, but to teach it using language that women coming out of the evangelical church will connect to. There needs to be lifting up of different images of biblical womanhood, like, for example, Abigail, who defied her husband, the women in the Bible who were set up as apostles by Paul. There's a need for education that meets women where they're at in far-right spaces and uses language that will be easily understood by them. Expecting a mother of 8 under 9 with a high school diploma to have time to read pages and pages of theory is impractical and kind of cruel. White women especially need to commit to being in community with each other. If those women ever decide to leave, or if they want other education, they need people to call, and they need infrastructure for if they decide to leave. There needs to be education opportunities, job training, shelters that will hold all 8 of their children. So in conclusion, I think there's one thing that I think for all of these is that white women need to call each other in, and they need to explain this to each other. There cannot be ignorance around how white supremacy is affecting us. And the ways in which white supremacy enacts its pronatalist agenda are varied, and its methods are situationally adaptable, but they need to be called out for their connection, while efforts to address them need to be cognizant of the different types of women they are targeting and the different types of solutions that they require. I do think these problems are surmountable, but only if we're having conversations about them. Thank you.
Thank you, Amelie. Next, we have Emily Galpern.
Thank you, Nicole. Thank you, Loretta and Jalicia and the planning team and everybody here. We are very close to discussion and Q&A, I promise. It's a lot of, I think we could each probably scream a whole bunch of times, but based on all the things that we're hearing today, it's not a lot of time to process all of this deep information. I'm Emily Galpern, a consultant with the Center for Genetics and Society, and we focus on assisted reproduction and genetic technologies, as we've been talking about today, the various forms. And a hopeful project that we're doing right now is a cross-movement convening series. These are conversations with a small group of folks from reproductive justice, disability rights, and LGBTQ rights movements. We're looking at our shared values and grappling with the tensions we have across our movements on issues of reproductive and genetic technologies, so that these sticking points don't become cause for dividing us in our larger fights for reproductive, disability, and LGBTQ rights and justice. All of us in the group value reproductive autonomy and family formation for everyone. And at the same time, we know that use of the technologies can reinforce eugenic beliefs about people with disabilities, as many people have talked, several panelists have talked about already today, and can involve exploitation of women who are surrogates or egg donors. So sometimes the policy priorities of our movements are at odds. For example, introducing legislation to increase access to reproductive technologies without advocating for safeguards for the health and rights of egg donors and surrogates. And the language of one movement can usually unintentionally undermine another movement's goals. For example, writing an op-ed about insurance coverage for IVF, but characterizing success as the birth of a child without a disability. To delve into these tensions authentically, we've needed to focus not just on families or specific technologies or the infertility industry. We've had to look at the larger context of white male supremacy, anti-Black racism, and Christian nationalism dominating our country. because without this broader context, we end up focusing on individual decisions. And that's not where we want to put our focus, on the individual decisions prospective parents are making about having children. We want to focus on the larger forces that influence and support and constrain those decisions. So, grounded in this larger context, I want to make 3 points today. 1, eugenic ideology drives reproductive and genetic technologies, which as the basis has already been laid very strongly for that. 2, exploitation is part of the assisted reproductive technology industry, also talked about already. And 3rd, our reproductive futures depend on a collective response building on the strength of our movements. And our movements are strong, and how strong they can be when we are in solidarity together. So first, eugenics. As we've already been talking about today, eugenics is the idea that society can be improved through controlling reproduction. Historically, the state's been the driving actor, as we know. In the context of assisted reproduction, eugenic ideology is advanced by the fertility industry, which offers people the promise that they can choose what kind of baby to have through embryo selection technologies. The ongoing expansion in genetic screening and selection is fueled by the idea that only a certain kind of human should be brought into the world, and specifically reflects stigmatization of people with disabilities that's already embedded in our society. So there's ongoing pressure to use genetic selection technologies to prevent the birth of children with disabilities and have a, quote, normal child, as Rosemarie talked about. And there's increased hype about the potential to choose the traits people want for their children. I'm not sure how many people have seen ads from this new company called Nucleus that has a huge ad campaign in New York City on subways and billboards. It says, pick your baby, have your best baby. It's the modern way to have a family. So this company ranks embryos by genes that, in the interaction of thousands of genes, and prospective parents pay $9,000 to indicate preferences for eye color, hair color, height, and ostensibly IQ. And their menu includes more than 2,000 conditions that have or may have a genetic component. So eugenics in the context of reproductive and genetic technologies isn't about people's individual choices. It's an ideology that's foundational to the rhetoric and expectations surrounding assisted reproduction. I think Laurie talked about this. What technologies are brought onto the market and the policies that exist or intentionally don't exist in order to support it. Second, I want to talk about exploitation, specifically how it's embedded in the fertility industry. And as Jalicia was saying, a multi-billion-dollar global industry, which is focused on profit, not on people. The health and rights of everyone involved, the surrogates, the egg and sperm donors, children born from the technologies, intended parents, are not central to their business models. And neither are those who have no access to fertility treatment, let alone basic health care. Assisted reproduction has brought millions of people the families they have longed for and could not otherwise have. Many surrogates and egg donors have found meaning in making that possible. Many people born through assisted reproduction express happiness with their experiences and their families. These technologies have had many positive and wonderful outcomes. There is also an underside that we need to acknowledge and have been discussing today. Surrogates who report they've been left with medical debt, canceled health insurance, loss of their own fertility, harm to their health, are not paid the full amount of their contract. Reports are not scientific studies. We don't want to pretend this. But they illuminate the underside that does exist in the industry. The lack of safeguards to ensure that surrogates and egg donors have the information they need to make fully informed decisions. The absence of research to accurately determine the health risks involved. The lack of power surrogates and egg donors have to challenge unfair practices or treatment. There are currently some efforts to address exploitation of surrogates that are extremely problematic because they reinforce gender norms and undermine women's agency. Some of these efforts are integrating anti-trans ideology. This is not the way that we want to challenge exploitation. A reproductive justice lens is essential to tackling the issue of exploitation of women in the industry. So one of the reasons we put together our cross-movement conversations was to make sure we don't take a simplistic or binary perspective, but bring the wisdom and activism of multiple liberation movements. There's a lot of wisdom in this room. There's a lot of wisdom that's come into us being able to have the wisdom in this room. There's a lot of wisdom beyond this room and into the future. We want to take leadership in moving to a society that values the lives of people with disabilities. that safeguards the health and rights of surrogates and egg donors, that guarantees legal recognition for LGBTQ parents and all parents using assisted reproduction, and provides knowledge of biological origins for people born through these technologies. So this takes me to my final point, our collective future. Our blueprint for the future must actively and skillfully challenge exploitative practices and eugenic ideology in the landscape of reproduction, assisted and otherwise. We don't want the driving forces behind family building to be techie pronatalists and venture capitalists, anti-choice embryo personhood advocates, and white supremacist policymakers. We want advocates for reproductive, gender, disability, and LGBTQ rights and justice, and other liberationists to be in control of narratives around families, communities, and all aspects of reproduction. We want our folks to take the lead on policy, which requires navigating the tensions across and within our movements to make sure we can genuinely stand in solidarity together. We want our movements to work toward a collective future where all lives and families are deemed precious, where health, rights, and dignity are ensured. We want a future that values, celebrates, and welcomes the diversity of humanity. We do have the courage, the tools, and the imagination to do this, and we can build this together. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily.